I'm Andrew Hall, and this is Dead Hand Radio. My guest for this episode is Matthew Kresal. Matthew is a researcher and author with an interest in the Cold War, UFOs, and science fiction. He's a recurring guest on this show, and he's just released a new book, Our Man on the Hill. In this episode, Matt and I will be talking about his new book and the events that inspired it, McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Welcome back to Dead Hand Radio, Matt.
Thank you for having me again. Always a pleasure.
Oh, it's always good to talk to you, man. As I mentioned, your interests, the Cold War, UFOs, and science fiction, coincide with my interests very, very nicely. We have a lot in common, and it's always interesting to talk to you.
Indeed.
So, if you would, just for anybody, any listeners who aren't familiar with your work, just give a brief summary of how you got interested in the Cold War, and talk a little bit about your interest in UFOs and science fiction as well, and how you became an author.
Oh, certainly. My interest in the Cold War, I suspect, probably comes out of being a space nerd from a very young age. I was born and raised around Huntsville, Alabama, which, for those who don't know, is the home of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, and where the Saturn V, which was used for the Apollo missions, was designed and built in large part. I joked to a boss of mine at work the other day, who noticed I was wearing a mask with all the Apollo patches on it, that I basically came out of the womb a space nerd. And I became very interested in spaceflight from a young age. My parents used to check out NASA documentaries for me out of the library and that kind of thing. And I think because I was interested in that, I started wanting to know what was the context around the early space race, because I would watch things and I would hear about the Cold War and the Russians. And I think that sparked my kind of interest in that. And being a space nerd from a young age, I was also interested in science fiction. When you're a kid, space is space. It doesn't matter if it's, NASA documentaries or Star Trek, it's all space, and it's all fascinating to kind of hear. And I suspect, through that, my interest in ufology came out of that as well. And kind of coalesced in a weird way in a show from the mid-90s called Dark Skies, which ran on NBC for one season. And that brought together the Cold War, ufology, alternate history, threw it all together in one big blender and created a magnificent TV show out of it. And I rediscovered the show in 2013 and decided, somebody really ought to write a book about this. And there's an old saying that sometimes you have to write the book that you would like to read. And in the case of the Dark Skies one, that was 100% true, because nobody else had written it. It took 3 years and 3 different publishers before I found somebody crazy enough to let me do that, which was Obverse Books out of the UK. And they were kind enough to let me go off and do it. And that book, published as part of their Silver Archive series, dealing with cult TV topics, was published last April. And we did an episode about it last year, as a matter of fact. And it was while researching the Dark Skies book and being kind of immersed in that Cold War period, that I got interested in the McCarthy period, because the Red Scare is a big influence on things like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and that kind of whole period of 50s science fiction, the enemy within, as it were. And the McCarthy novel, which is now out, Our Man on the Hill, was very much a side project from Dark Skies. So my life, as you might say, is a series of interesting, interrelated Venn diagrams, just overlapping each other at various points.
Very cool. And I like the way you tie all these areas of interest in together. And I feel the same way, man. There is a huge overlap between UFOs and the Cold War, and the whole science fiction genre just is, it's fodder for the whole science fiction genre, the Cold War, UFOs, and all that. My own interest in the Cold War led me to looking into a lot deeper into the UFO topic. So I kind of went maybe a little bit the opposite direction, where I was a Cold War. I was interested in Cold War first, and then because of the interest in nukes that the UFOs have, that led me to start looking into the UFOs more. But so it's since, like you said, we talked recently. I guess it was a few months ago that we were talking about. Maybe it was even longer than a few months. But we talked about your last book, which was it part of an anthology, or was it a series of short books?
It's a series of short books. The Silver Archive series, published by Obverse, basically was a series of, I think monographs is the term they like to use. So they're about 100, 120 page long books,
Okay.
running 20 to 30,000 words. And it's a funny story about the Dark Skies book, because after having done the first draft and gotten notes back from my editor, I managed to get in touch with Bryce Zabel and Brent Friedman, who were the creators of Dark Skies. And the book actually grew by a third as a result of their involvement and being willing to talk to me. And in Bryce's case, being willing to spend 3 or 4 days digging through his archives and scanning me production documents and stuff and sending them to me. So that book is still available from Obverse for those who are interested in acquiring it.
I don't have your book, but I happen to have another book that was co-written by Bryce Zabel and Richard Dolan. I don't know how that's working, but so there's your book. This is another book by Bryce Zabel, AD After Disclosure, about the UFO topic.
Which, for those who haven't read it, is a superb read, and it's actually that book in a roundabout sort of way that led to me rediscovering Dark Skies as well.
Very cool. Yeah, Bryce is. I think he could be considered one of the top authorities on the UFO topic. And he has been for a long time.
Yeah,
and that book
certainly within Hollywood. I mean, he's incredibly well read on the topic, and of course, Richard Dolan being a preeminent historian of the topic as well, being one of the people who's delved into the archives and looked into it. So you put the two of them together and basically go, okay, what happens when we get to the day when somebody has to finally say, hey, this is all real. And it presents some interesting stuff. And I recommend the book, even if you're a UFO skeptic. If you want to have fun with a sort of what if scenario, AD After Disclosure is a fantastic read.
Yeah. And a lot of what's in that book is kind of coming to pass right now. We'll get to that a little bit later, because I definitely want to talk to you about the UFO topic. But and before we talk about your book a little bit more, and we'll go into depth with that, it's been, like I said, it's been 5 or 6 months since we last talked. How have things been going for you since then? Since we last talked?
Well, obviously, I've had a novel come out, so I'm doing pretty good in that regard. I've kept busy sort of writing a lot of the time, so I've had some short fiction published by various people. I just had a Sherlock Holmes story published by Bellinger Books as part of their Sherlock Holmes Stranger Than Fiction anthology. Which the premise of which was basically to write Sherlock Holmes crossovers with other pieces of public domain fiction of the same era. So I got to write a Sherlock Holmes sequel to Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon and Around the Moon, having some fun with the lunar landing conspiracy theories of today transposed back into the steampunk era, which was fun to do. And I've also had, through my publisher of my novel, Sea Lion Press, published a short story of mine called Moonshot, published in their anthology Alternate Australias back in December, just around Christmas, which imagined a British-Australian space program trying to get to the moon in the mid-1960s, based on one of the proposals that was suggested for what became Apollo but wasn't acted upon. I'm just sent off 2 or 3 short stories for some various Doctor Who charity anthologies, all strictly unofficial, but raising money for good causes. So, I am nerd here be bore, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, it's good to see you keeping busy in the field of writing, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Doctor Who stuff, because don't you also participate in a podcast where you guys talk about Doctor Who, or Doctor Who based podcast?
I've done a couple in the past. I did one that was specific to the Big Finish audio dramas, which are the licensed audio dramas based on the show, and that ran from 2013 to 2017, called Stories from the Vortex. You can still Google it. The episodes I did there with Mary Lang and Robert Haynes were my co-hosts there. And those are all still available to listen to. They're on archive.org as well. And I'm a reoccurring host on 2 or 3 other Doctor Who podcasts, including the 20 megabyte Doctor Who podcast. I haven't been on there since, I think, January. Was Earth Station Who as well, which is a wonderful podcast based out of the Atlanta area. I was on here recently talking about a Fifth Doctor story called Time Flight. Let's say that one was fun. And there's another one called the Discussion Network, which I pop up on from time to time too. So again, I really need a T-shirt that says "I am nerd, hear me bore."
Well, okay. So as I've told you in the past, I have never been interested in Doctor Who at all, and not everybody is. It's not for everybody. But if I know a lot of people that are interested in it, I'd like to have intelligent conversations with people. But what's the best way for somebody who has never really been into the whole Doctor Who franchise? What's the best way for them to get interested in it and kind of start going down that path of watching the Doctor?
A lot of it is down to personal taste, I found, and what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for somebody else. If you're a fan of older science fiction and you don't mind less than 21st century production values, Classic Who, as they call it, which ran from 63 to 89, is available in places. You can buy seasons on Amazon. You can buy Blu-ray sets are coming out now. If you like British TV in general, BritBox, the streaming service, has everything that survives from Classic Who up there where you can watch it as part of your subscription on there, plus a wealth of other great British TV shows. If you prefer 21st century production values, Modern Who is your way to go. And most of the seasons of Modern Who are designed so that you can basically pick a season and pick a doctor and start watching from there. And it's nice to have kind of prerequisite knowledge of what's gone before, but you don't necessarily have to. One of the things I often suggest to people with 21st century Who is to go watch an episode. There's 2 episodes I recommend. One is called Blink. It's from the middle of the 3rd season. And it's not necessarily about the Doctor per se, but it's a great entrance into the Doctor Who universe, which does this great British science fiction thing of playing the extraordinary alongside the mundane. You think about H.G. Wells with War of the Worlds, has, typical beautiful British countryside suddenly being trampled and fired upon by Martians. And that's something that the British do really well. I think that many American authors, and I include myself in this, try to imitate that. We don't often succeed. But Blink is a great example of that because you get into the Doctor Who universe through basically the average person getting involved with the Doctor and kind of going, how do I get out of this situation? The other episode I recommend people do, if you just want a great flavor of what 21st century Doctor Who is like, is a story called The 11th Hour. It was Matt Smith, the 11th Doctor's first episode, and it is one of the best hours of television you will ever watch. It's a wonderful encapsulation of everything that makes Doctor Who in so many ways. There's time travel, there's the introduction of new companions, you get a wonderfully eccentric and very much likable Doctor in the form of Matt Smith. So basically, whatever your tastes are, pick a spot and start and go from there. And again, it's not for all tastes, YMMV, as the kids like to say. But give it, if you're interested in science fiction, particularly if you want a view of something that has lasted longer than some people's lifetimes, pick a spot in Doctor Who and go. But Blink and The 11th Hour would be my suggestions if you're wanting to give it a good start. And seasons are relatively cheap on DVD and Blu-ray. And if you have an HBO Max subscription, it's all on HBO Max in terms of 21st century Who.
Very cool.
So.
I do have an HBO Max, and I will check that out. Rather Be Squidding, he's a regular that joins the chat. great dude, and appreciate you being here. Rather, I don't know if we even know this guy's real name. Is that your real name, rather? But he says we need a Sherlock Holmes UAP UFO story, and yeah, I think that would be awesome. Uh,
That
there's
would
your
be
next book
interesting.
idea.
Well, it's kind of sort of been done. I haven't read it, but I do know somebody did a Holmes novel with Holmes and Watson updated to the 1940s. And there's actually one set in the late 40s, early 50s, which I haven't read. I think it is actually called Sherlock Holmes and the Roswell Incident, which has Holmes investigating Roswell. I have to admit that's a really interesting idea, and if I get the chance to pitch another Sherlock Holmes story for Bellinger or somewhere else, I will certainly give it an idea, because it's one of those ideas you think more people would have done it by now.
Definitely. I mean, he's wildly popular, but um, I think it would be well. Actually, there's a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories coming out right now, and we're getting off the topic. We'll get back onto your book in just a minute, but there's a lot of new Sherlock Holmes stories that are coming out. There was one on Netflix with the dude from Superman and the girl from
Yep,
Stranger Things. I don't,
yep, Enola Holmes, which is based on a series of novels set around Holmes's sister.
that was a great little series, and I think it's been picked up for a second season. I recommend everybody checking that one out. Um, and I just want to say hello to some of the other people in the chat room. Galen, thanks for being here, and Rodrigo, very awesome for you to be here, my friend. I hope this time slot is good for you guys, because we are going to continue in this time slot as well as the other two time slots that we have. So I appreciate you guys being here. Um, Now, so Matt, going back to your book, we've already talked about the title. How did you come up with that title, and what's the premise of the book?
So the title "Our Man on the Hill" came out of the fact that I realized that if I wanted to be strictly historically accurate, even though it's an alternate history spy thriller, I couldn't call it what its working title was, which was also, in a way, the elevator pitch for it, which was basically Joe McCarthy, KGB. Um, I actually have to say that part of the blame for this belongs to a podcast called Spybury, uh, hosted by a wonderful guy named Shane Whaley. If you have any interest in spy fiction whatsoever, I very much recommend giving it a go. And I've been fortunate enough; I've appeared on the show a few times over the years. But it started in 2017, and as a writer, one of my other interests had always been espionage fiction. You know, James Bond, John le Carre's George Smiley books. All of that had been of interest to me. And I think like a lot of people in delving into the Cold War, the Cold War, while it certainly had its military conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, you name it, a lot of it was fought in the proverbial shadows, whether it's, whether it's agents of the CIA and the KGB, the various submarines under the sea conducting espionage things, books like Blind Man's Bluff, which I read in the late 90s when I was like 12 and absolutely adored. And I knew I wanted to write a spy story at some point. I didn't know what I wanted it to be, and I didn't necessarily want to write, as much as I love James Bond, I didn't want to write a James Bond ripoff, or do, if you're going to write a James Bond book, write a proper James Bond book. And I didn't want to do something that was going to be kind of a knockoff of that. And as much as I love spy fiction and some of the more actiony stuff, I also didn't want to write basically a shoot 'em up, which is what a lot of particularly American spy fiction is. And I said, I want to do something a little more serious, but I don't know what. And then as a result of Spybury, I got interested in Cold War espionage again. And one day in my public library, I stumbled across a book I'd heard of but never read, called The Haunted Wood. And this was published in the late 1990s and was written by the historian Alan Weinstein and a Russian journalist who was also former KGB named Alexander Veselov. And what they did was that in the mid 90s, this is sort of during the Yeltsin period, right after the Cold War ended, they were given access to the Soviet intelligence archives from the 1930s and 40s. which is of immense interest to those of us who are interested in the espionage aspects, particularly how it deals with the Red Scare. And in reading the book, I read some of these extraordinary stories, including one about a congressman from New York City named Samuel Dickstein, who, for a period of about 2-3 years in the late 30s, was a spy for the Russians under the code name Crook, which perhaps being a politician was apt. And I was reading it, and somewhere along the line, I came across this wonderful quote from Harry Truman at a press conference from March 1950, where he was asked about McCarthy. And this is while McCarthy is on the ascent. And he says that the Kremlin today has no greater asset in the United States than Joe McCarthy. Now we know what Truman meant by that was that, he was great in sort of, creating kind of this smokescreen and whatnot and stirring people up. And the Russians could and did, in fact, point to McCarthy and see the Americans have lost their minds. But if you know anything about espionage fiction, you know that asset has a very different meaning to it. It's also, you can interchange it for spy, agent, whatever. And even though that's not what that quote said, a light bulb went off in my head. And I said, I'm going to write this. I thought it was going to be a short story. And I wrote what's today chapters 2 and 3 of the novel. And I kind of went, oh crap, I've started writing a novel. Because I thought I was going to write maybe a 10,000 word short story. And I suddenly realized, oh no, I've got something. I need a bigger canvas to write on here. And this was in the period where I was still researching the Dark Skies book and I hadn't started writing it all the way. So basically, my sort of side project while I was working on the Dark Skies book was writing this rather crazy little thriller in which the most infamous hunter of communists in American history was in fact an agent for them all along.
That is certainly a twist on history, man. Before you go any further, and
yes.
I just want to make sure that everybody that listens to this now and in the future understands who Senator Joseph McCarthy was, what was his form of the witch hunts that he perpetuated on the American public, and called McCarthyism, right? And what is the Red Scare? So let's give people just a little quick history lesson about that. But and how did you adopt this into a novel where this guy is a KGB agent? We'll get into that part next, but go ahead and give him a little bit of insight on the historical factual part of this.
So Joe McCarthy was a ambitious, fairly young congressman senator, I should say, because he was in the Senate, not the House, from the wonderful state of Wisconsin. And in some ways, he was a fairly admirable figure. I mean, if you can read the biographies of him, and I did read a couple while I was doing the book. There's a wonderful one by, I think it's Thomas Witcher, I think's his name, called Shooting Star, which is very sort of brief and concise. But McCarthy was essentially a rags to riches guy. This is a guy who dropped out of school at like 15, 16, ran his family's chicken farm, ran it very successfully for years. And then when the chickens all died, convinced a local school to let him do 4 years of high school in a year and passed with flying colors and was popular enough. He got elected, I think, president of the senior class. He goes off, he gets a law degree. He serves in the Pacific during World War II, exaggerates his war record. Gets involved with the local Democrats there in Wisconsin. This is the 1930s and 40s. So this is the New Deal era, Roosevelt, etc. But McCarthy realizes that if he wants to progress, he's going to have to go to the other side. So he becomes a Republican. He tries running in 44, doesn't get elected, runs again in 46, gets elected, and basically for the next few years sits in Congress doing not a heck of a lot. And then all of a sudden, in February 1950, literally days after one of the most infamous figures of the Red Scare, Alger Hiss, is convicted on perjury charges, having been accused of being a Soviet spy by, amongst others, Richard Nixon, then a congressman from California. McCarthy stands up and he gives a speech in a town called Wheeling, West Virginia, where he insists that he has in his hand a list of 205 members of the Communist Party currently in the State Department. And he's on a speaking tour, so he goes across the country. The number varies from speech to speech, but McCarthy finds an issue that literally catapults him to the top of the political game. He's been basically a no-name Republican senator up until this point, and suddenly he's very much dictating the Republican agenda.
So
Let
me ask you a quick question right there. So
yes.
He's touting this alleged list, right, of 200 and
yes.
something communists that are serving in our government. Did he actually have a list of people, or was he just bolstering?
It doesn't appear that he ever had a list. There's a clip I came across in a documentary where he was being interviewed by some newsmen, and one of them mentions that the Secretary of State at the time, whose name escapes me at the moment, says he is not aware of anybody. And McCarthy's like, well, you can tell him I have a list and I will be staying at such and such hotel, and if he will call me this evening, I will give it to him. As far as we know, the phone call never happened, of course.
Or he never answered the call, right? If the phone call came, McCarthy probably never picked up the phone.
Right. But he goes on a whole tirade, and it lasts for years. And he makes charges, and then when charges don't pan out, indeed, and McCarthy as well had some great luck of timing, because his initial run from sort of February 1950 to June, basically there's a Senate committee that gets together that he's a member of that investigates his charges, and they basically find there's no basis for it. And literally days later, the Korean War breaks out, and McCarthy is able to go on the attack again. And he basically spares nobody for the next 3 or 4 years. He goes after not just Harry Truman, who was the increasingly unpopular president of the United States in this period, but people like George C. Marshall, who had been the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II, later the Secretary of State, the guy behind the Marshall Plan that basically rebuilt Western Europe after World War II. There's a book that McCarthy, in fact, takes one of his speeches and publishes as a very successful book. He's so successful, in fact, that when Marshall's protege, who you may have heard of, named Dwight D. Eisenhower, runs for president in 1952, there's a meeting in Peoria, Illinois, between McCarthy and Eisenhower. And the substance of the meeting is supposed to be Eisenhower basically going, I know we're doing a campaign event tomorrow night. I'm going to give you fair warning. I'm going to criticize you for going after Marshall. Now, we don't know what was said in this conversation, which is great fodder for a novelist, I have to tell you. But we do know it didn't last very long. Voices were raised, and at the end of it, Eisenhower dropped all references to Marshall in attacking McCarthy in his speech. And you can Google this moment the following evening when they have their campaign event together. There's this really awkward handshake where McCarthy is big, toothy, grin, happy as could be, and Eisenhower cannot be more uncomfortable with the situation he's now finding himself in. McCarthy was that powerful, that the guy who led not just was leading the Republicans to a victory in the 1952 elections, but had also essentially been the guy behind the defeat of Hitler in Europe, leading as the supreme commander of the Allied armies, couldn't contradict him. And McCarthy is eventually brought down by his own hubris. He, interestingly enough, again, great fodder for a novelist. In 1953, he tries to go after the CIA, claiming the CIA has been infiltrated by the Russians, which leads to a clash between him and the CIA. And in 1954, in part because his right-hand man, Roy Cohen, who is a closet homosexual in this period, his boyfriend has been drafted into the army, and Cohen is trying to use McCarthy's influence to get his boyfriend either out of the army or into lesser duties. And when the army won't play along, Cohen gets McCarthy to charge that the army is full of communists, and there's a famous series of hearings, the first ever televised live on TV, called the Army McCarthy hearings. And there's a wonderful documentary. Because they were aired live, they were also recorded onto film in a very primitive, wonderful format of pointing a film camera at a TV screen and literally recording the screen. But that footage was turned into a wonderful documentary that's still available, called Point of Order. And what happened is that because McCarthy was into American living rooms day in and day out for, I think it's dozens, if not hundreds of hours, McCarthy's reputation took a hit because it revealed him to be what he was, which was a ambitious bully without a whole lot of factual information to actually back his charges. And McCarthy essentially is broken by this. And he always had a bit of a drinking problem by most accounts, but he basically, even though, he gets married, him and his much younger wife adopt a young daughter, but it's not enough to save him. He actually dies in 1957, likely as a result of his alcoholism, kind of broken and forgotten.
So let's back up, rewind it a little bit, because we kind of
Yes.
glossed over how serious the communist threat was in the U.S. at that time, because it was a very serious threat. There were agents in the U.S. As you mentioned, one of them that was caught and convicted.
Alger Hiss, who was, though it's worth noting with that, by the time McCarthy gets on the scene in 1950, making these charges, a lot of that is said, done, and over with. It's sort of worth remembering the context as well, that this became a political football. In some ways, McCarthy's great legacy is that he takes what is fundamentally a national security issue. Are there Soviet spies in the American government, or have there been Soviet spies in the American government? And McCarthy wasn't alone in this. We mentioned Richard Nixon, and also the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, had spent 3 or 4 years prior to McCarthy coming on the scene doing this with Alger Hiss and others. And it is absolutely true that there were, in the 1930s and 40s, especially during World War II, there were a lot of Americans who were willing to pass on information to the Soviets. Let's be very clear about that. That was true. We know this not just because the Russians opened their archives up to people like Weinstein and Vasilev for their book, The Haunted Wood, but throughout the 1940s, what was then Army Signal Intelligence intercepted Soviet communications out of the embassy in D.C., but also the consulate in New York City. And when the NSA is formed in the late 1940s, the NSA takes over their effort to decrypt these messages. There are literally tens of thousands of them, of which, because of the particular kind of encryption that was used, we've only ever been able to decipher, I think it's something like 10 to 12%. It's something known as Venona on our side. It's this project that runs from the 1940s all the way to the early 1980s. And it uncovers that very much the case that there were Soviet spies, not only in the Manhattan Project, which is developing the atomic bomb in this period, but there's also Soviet spies in the State Department, one of whom is Lawrence Duggan, who is the right-hand man to Cordell Hull, who's the Secretary of State, the last Secretary of State under Roosevelt, and was also quite friendly with Henry Wallace, who was the vice president during Roosevelt's third term, who was on fairly friendly terms with Russia. There's spies in the OSS as well. The OSS, for those who don't know, the Office of Strategic Services was the precursor to the CIA. And the Russians, through what was then called the NKVD, had infiltrated people into there, or they had recruited people into there. Including William Donovan, who ran the agency's right-hand man. So it's absolutely true that there were Soviet agents in the United States throughout the 30s and 40s who were passing on information. So, if you want to argue, as people like, for example, Ann Coulter and Glenn Beck have done in the years since Venona, that there's an argument to be made that McCarthy was right to some degree. Yes, in the broadest strokes. The problem becomes, you actually have to go look at who Joe McCarthy named. And of all the people Joe McCarthy named, the ones that we could actually definitively prove through the Soviet archives and through Venona, who were actually spying for the Russians, is pretty much non-existent. So there's a lot of innocent people who get sort of caught up in this very wide net that McCarthy puts out. Or, if I may be ironic for a moment, to use a Russian proverb, one cannot plant a million seeds and not reap one potato. So that's certainly true. I mean, there's a lot of innocent people like Owen Latimer, for example, who was in the State Department, who was one of the known so-called China hands. One of the big accusations in this period is that the Roosevelt-Truman administrations lost China because China goes communist in 1949 after this decades-long civil war between the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who we supported, and also Mao Zedong's communists. And there were people in China, in the OSS, and in the State Department who knew that the moment World War II ended, there would be a resumption of the Chinese Civil War, and that if we were smart about things, we would get Mao Zedong and the Chinese leftists on our side, because Chiang Kai-shek was not going to win. He wasn't popular. He didn't have enough men. And the smartest thing we could do, particularly if we're worried about the Russians, is to get them on side. And of course, that advice is ignored. But because they've made the mistake of saying, hey, we might want to get these people who are to the left of, eventually to the left of Joe McCarthy on side potentially, they get branded as communists as well. And Latimer is an example of one of these people who was not, as far as we can tell from the available evidence, at all a Soviet spy. Had his career ruined and got run out of the State Department. He's just one of countless people. McCarthy, I think, in the end, named something close to 200 people across his 4 or 5 year tirade that he goes on. And again, the number of them who actually are agents for the Soviet Union are pretty much non-existent. He doesn't name his, people like... Go ahead.
And his... accusations or so-called trials was not limited to government people only. Didn't they bring in authors and people from Hollywood, other like well-known celebrities that were accused of different, these different activities of being in coercion or being in cahoots with the communists?
That's not necessarily McCarthy, but that's his buddies, as it were, over on HUAC, which is the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Okay.
And they are doing that in the 3 or 4 year period leading up to when McCarthy makes his speech, and also after McCarthy made his speech. And that creates a whole list of problems as well. It has to be said, HUAC was marginally more successful in actually rooting out communist agents in the United States, people like Alger Hiss, for example. And it's worth remembering with Alger Hiss, who we now have through Venona and also through the KGB archives, fairly conclusive proof that he was indeed passing information to the Soviets. The problem is that Venona was classified until 1995. And that was not made available to investigators for people like Alger Hiss or even the Rosenbergs, for example, the husband and wife who were put on trial for stealing the secrets of the atomic bomb and are eventually executed for that. Venona was the things that could have clinched their things. But the problem is that the evidence that was actually available to investigators at the time was not conclusive in the slightest. And indeed, it wasn't until Venona came around. And to be fair as well with Venona, that while Venona is a great source, some of it is guesswork on the part of cryptographers. If anybody has seen for the more recent film version of Midway by Roland Emmerich, there's scenes in there talking about the way that American code breakers broke the Japanese codes. And there's a scene in there where I think it's Rochford, who's the lead cryptographer, is explaining that they're actually only reading about 25 to 30% of the Japanese messages. So they're filling in context clues as they go, basically. And some of the Venona messages are like that. So while Venona is a great source, it isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all of proving the very large thing. And getting back to McCarthy definitely didn't have Venona. There's a wonderful section briefly in The Haunted Wood where there's discussion amongst, I think it's the CIA at one point, about saying, should we let McCarthy know about this? And they're like, oh God, no. He's going to go around waving messages about everything else, and we're going to lose whatever advantage we've got there. So, McCarthy didn't name people like Samuel Dickstein, for example, the New York congressman who from 1937 to 1940 is spying for the Russians. He doesn't name a young man named Ted Hall, who was this 18-year-old physics genius who was recruited to the Manhattan Project, who had leftist leanings, who passed on the secrets of the atomic bomb. Basically, Ted Hall wasn't discovered till the mid-90s. He's literally the boy who gave away the bomb, and he got away with it because there wasn't any evidence to convict him with in an American court. Rosenbergs as well.
It could be argued that he wasn't he wasn't even on the radar of those that were looking into these to these spies.
Well, Ted Hall kind of sort of was. There's a point in 1950, again, 1950 is this kind of big pivotal year here, where there's investigations going on because somebody else in the Manhattan Project, a German-born physicist named Klaus Fuchs, who had gone to the UK during Hitler's persecutions and eventually was transferred from their atomic bomb project to Alloys to work on the Manhattan Project. And he spent the latter years of the war passing on information to the Soviets, and did after he got back to the UK, where he worked at Harwell, which was the British equivalent to the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. And Fuchs was arrested. They start looking at people Fuchs was associated with. And this is where, history takes some funny turns. Klaus Fuchs and Ted Hall worked in the same department of the Manhattan Project and were passing on basically the same information with variants, and were essentially confirming for the Soviet handlers back in Moscow that each other's work and proving that each other was legitimate. But neither one of them ever knew that the other one, these two work colleagues never knew that the other one was a Soviet spy.
But
because Fuchs gets caught.
So my question, okay, man, we are giving people a really deep dive into this whole topic, and it's amazing. But I do want to get in some questions. So
yeah,
regarding these two physicists that were given secrets to the Russians, what compelled them to do it? Was it their duty to humanity, knowing that if the Americans had the bomb and nobody else did, they would be likely to use it, and to give it to another adversary, there would be a deterrence to them using it? Or was it a monetary gain? What was their goal? What was their purpose for giving secrets?
The thing you have to know about most of the spies in this period, with notable exceptions, Samuel Dickstein is the big one, is that a lot of them aren't doing it for money. They're doing it from ideology. And the way that the Russians often recruited in this period wasn't to say, hey, I represent Joseph Stalin's regime in Moscow. It was, you see what's going on in Europe. You see that the Nazis are on the rise. You see Mussolini's on the rise. The fascists are on the march. And, nobody is doing anything. We're the ones willing to do it. And if you will help us, we can work together to stop the Nazis. And that was a lot of it. Klaus Fuchs was German-born. He eventually settles back in East Germany after he gets caught and released from prison. Ted Hall was Jewish and had relatives in Europe who died in the Holocaust. And in the case of Fuchs and Hall, it was very much a case of, we can't let the Nazis have the atomic bomb, and somebody else has got to do it. And if we can help the Russians do it, it's worth mentioning too that Fuchs was a closet communist in this period as well. And keep in mind too, this is the 1930s and 40s, the Great Depression. 30% of the country at one point is out of work or not working enough to make ends meet. And there is genuinely a sense amongst a certain group of people throughout the 1930s that communism is the way of the future. And you also have to remember, we didn't know about the purges going on. We didn't know about basically the planned genocide that was happening against minority groups inside the Soviet Union. All the world had was the Soviet propaganda, which, to the discredit of so many people in this period, they bought into. And they believed this kind of image that was projected of a utopia in the making, which could not have been farther from the truth. Right. And it's worth mentioning that when the war was over, Ted Hall stopped spying for the Soviets. Klaus Fuchs kept on doing it until he was caught in 1949, I believe. A lot of these people who spied for the Russians stopped at the end of the war. And particularly if they carried on, they stopped within the next 2 to 3 years, basically, when you have things like, the purges happening across Eastern Europe, the Berlin blockade of 48-49. And it's revealed that the Soviets are not the utopia makers that they've made themselves out to be.
Far from it. I mean,
what happens?
The exact opposite. A brutal dictatorship with eyes on the rest of the world.
To a large extent, yeah. I mean, it was. I
Well,
don't necessarily
it's in their
think
doctrine. It's in their doctrine to spread communists to the four corners of the world.
right, and that becomes what gets seized upon by people like McCarthy and whatnot.
Right.
So, getting back to the original question from 20 minutes ago, McCarthy was right in the broad strokes that there were Soviet spies in the American government. They were not, on the other hand, to follow up McCarthy's other charges, taking orders from Moscow to dictate American policy in certain directions. What they were great at doing was telling the Russians what we were thinking and what we were doing, which also, to be fair, because we live in a free democratic society with a free press, a lot of times they could get that same information out of the Washington Post and the New York Times. Indeed, a lot of what was going back to Moscow at one point in 1946, because one of the Soviet couriers had defected and basically blown everything to the FBI, was that they were basically cutting stuff out of the newspaper and transmitting it on and sending it by radio on to Moscow. It's kind of weird how this stuff works. But McCarthy, basically, by the time he arrives in 1950, this is all, the golden age of Soviet espionage in the United States is over. It's being investigated. There's not a whole lot anybody can do. So McCarthy essentially arrives too late, too loud, and with too little factual information to actually catch anybody who's actually involved. McCarthy, if you'll pardon the analogy, is like you having a burglar in your house, calling the police, and they send the SWAT team to take down everybody in the house. Because that's essentially what McCarthy does. And he, in fact, creates a lot of damage down the road, the repercussions of which we're still dealing with. I'll give an example, if I may. So there's a Chinese citizen who's working at what becomes the Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in California throughout the 1930s and 40s, working on jet aircraft and rocket development. In fact, he is such a smart guy, he actually gets to interview Wernher von Braun not long after he's brought over to the United States at the end of 1945. In 1950, because McCarthy has created all this stink, this Chinese-born scientist, because he's not an American citizen, he's applied for American citizenship, is put under house arrest for years. And then he is deported back to China, where after going through political rehabilitation to get in with the communists, he becomes the founder of the Chinese space program. And he builds missiles for the Chinese military and also the rockets, which have just this past week sent in China's first probe to Mars. And that is a consequence of the atmosphere that McCarthy created. Because if the guy had stayed here, China probably would have eventually got a missile program and a space program of its own. But they got a leap start because we sent one of the smartest people that we had back to China because he was Chinese and because we thought he might be a communist.
Right. So colossal blunders, very little, if any, successes. The entire policy was ill-founded and sounds like it was a little bit too late. One thing that is kind of has actually come up into my mind lately is we have a habit of in this country of like looking at a specific group of people as a threat to national security or a threat to our way of living, right? Is there any risk of a modern day Joseph McCarthy rising up in the ranks and causing the same kind of havoc that this guy wrought on our country back in that day?
I'm going to be very careful with the way I answer this because
that's a good idea. Yeah, I'm not saying don't name any names or any political parties, but is there a risk?
I'll put it this way. There is a direct through line from the McCarthy period to the present day, and I'll give an example. You may remember earlier in the conversation, I mentioned a gentleman named Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was a prosecutor originally. He's the one who sent the Rosenbergs to the electric chair. And after he had done that, Joe McCarthy was so impressed with him that McCarthy hired him to be his right-hand man. And after he had essentially helped disgrace McCarthy through his and his boyfriend's antics, he went back to New York and he became a mob lawyer and also a lawyer to the rich and powerful in New York City, where in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s until he died of AIDS, Roy Cohn ingratiated himself with a young up-and-coming real estate developer and whispered in his ears his first notions of political ambitions.
Okay, very interesting.
So there is a through line to the present day through Roy Cohn and the guy who essentially became Roy Cohn's kind of protege and adopted a lot of his and McCarthy's tactics in finding, groups of people to attack, but also never answer charges, always keep on the attack. And that's all I'm really going to say there without naming
we can leave it at that, because I don't want to drag anybody's name through the mud, and I don't want to draw any heat to this program.
Yeah.
So that's a well thought out answer, and I didn't front load you with that question either. You didn't know I was going to ask that question, so good on you for answering that delicately. So that's a ton of information about the McCarthy era, how it kind of played out, and the significance to American history, particularly politics. So talk about your book and how did you adopt real world events into a fictional telling of this character?
What essentially happened is that having read The Haunted Wood, I got interested in McCarthy, and I started reading up on McCarthy, and there ended up being, and I have to say, as I did earlier, that I was working on the Dark Skies book at this time, and it was only actually when we were setting up to talk today that I made this connection in my head. That Dark Skies is, for those who don't know the series, that the whole premise of the show is that it's an alternate history where the history as we know it is a lie for the back half of the 20th century, that there's all these historical figures and events that tie into this shadowy conflict involving the various UFO conspiracy theories. And I suspect that my brain was in that mindset when I created this novel, because I went through McCarthy's history and his biography and kind of went, well, that seems odd and that seems strange, and I can morph this around, because a lot of it turns on some very strange things. For example, when McCarthy was first elected to Congress in 1946, part of how he did was he actually got, very unusual for a Republican in this period, the support of various workers' unions in Wisconsin. One of which, and this was one of those things, it was just very strange to read, was a communist-leaning radio workers' union. And it just seemed very strange to me that the guy who would become the most infamous hunter of communists in American history was elected in large part because this group of radio workers who had a tendency to lean towards communism voted for him for reasons beyond human understanding. And there was another kind of great story about McCarthy's, that first big speech he gives in Wheeling, West Virginia, because it was part of a series of speeches he was kind of being sent on by the Republicans over the Lincoln's birthday holiday weekend for 1950. And he was supposed to be giving a speech about housing. This was part of what McCarthy had spent those 4 ill-gotten years in the Senate doing prior to that point, was focusing on housing of all things. But he's in a car with somebody whose name escapes me, and he goes, I've actually got 2 speeches here. I've got one on housing, and I've got one on communists. Which one do you think I should deliver? And it just seemed very strange as well that McCarthy happens to have 2 speeches sitting in his briefcase. What are the odds of that? And it was basically, I created a conspiracy theory, and a writing buddy of mine tried to convince me to write it as a nonfiction book. And I basically decided, as I told him, I value my reputation more than I do potentially writing something that's going to sell a lot of copies.
Bad advice from the friend. Good decision on your part.
Yeah, he may have been tongue-in-cheek, I hasten to add. You know how it is when you're texting back and forth.
Right.
But there was just a lot of kind of high strangeness around McCarthy. There were other things to, in terms of kind of the coincidences of things. Like, he gives that speech in Wheeling, for example, literally days after Alger Hiss is convicted for perjury. They couldn't prove Hiss was a spy, but they could prove he had lied in his testimony before Congress. So that was how they got him in jail. It's basically, what they did with Al Capone. If you can't get him for the crime, you can get him for tax evasion.
They're pretty good about that. They're pretty good about putting people in jail for ancillary charges. Like, you never would have got in trouble for that if you had just obeyed the law, but you're a criminal anyway, so you're paying for crimes that you're not actually convicted of, but you committed.
Right. But there was just enough strangeness around McCarthy, and I had been reading The Haunted Wood, so I had quite a bit of knowledge at that point. This is, as we talked about, something I'm interested in anyways. So I delved into quite a bit into the real history around it, and there's some fictional characters in the book. There's McCarthy's handler, who's posing as a journalist, for example, who's one of these sort of what the Soviets called the illegals. So these are guys who are trained to basically blend in with American society, and they basically sit there until somebody sends them the signal, to basically get involved.
And if I'm not mistaken, they're highly trained in the art of assassination.
They can be.
So they're very dangerous individuals because they are basically here alone with no support. And if they get into a scrap, they're either going to, go down for it, or they're going to fight their way out of it, escape and evade.
Right. Which it's not exactly an action novel, but there's a couple of moments of what you might call action in the book.
I wasn't trying to turn it into that. I was just saying that if McCarthy had a handler, that handler is probably a very dangerous individual. So he wouldn't want to get out of line with his handler, right?
Right. But also McCarthy's run-in with the CIA in 1953, which was fascinating in its own right, because the CIA gets so aggravated by McCarthy, because this is the period when the CIA is basically operating with impunity to large extents, with very little congressional oversight. So McCarthy barging in and saying, there are Soviet agents inside the CIA. The CIA at this period does exactly what you would expect them to do. They get some people to work into his office and they plant bugs in there. And at that point, it was like, that's a gift to a novelist there, as is the longtime head of CIA counterintelligence, this oddly named gentleman named James Jesus Angleton. Who was this tall, lanky, Yale-educated, could have been a poet in another life, who became utterly paranoid in the 1960s and 70s about Soviet infiltration, not just of the CIA, but of Western intelligence and society in general. To the point he became convinced that people like Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford were Soviet agents operating against them, and that the Soviets had created a wilderness of mirrors for Western intelligence and could make us believe whatever they wanted us to believe. And it was an interest of mine as well with Angleton, going, well, what leads a guy as smart as Angleton to end up believing something so crazy? And it's like, finding out Joe McCarthy as a Soviet agent might be an interesting thing. So I got to work that into the novel as well. So that was a lot of it, was basically going through, doing, I guess, as conspiracy theorists sometimes do, going through the historical record and going, well, that bit doesn't sound right, and that bit doesn't sound right. And instead of saying, there's a conspiracy here, going, I'm going to write a novel out of this.
You just pull on that thread, and nothing really comes out of that, because there's no documentation. There's no, witnesses are non-existent anymore, because everybody's from that era is no longer around. So you just make up stories, and you tack those made up stories onto real events. That's fascinating, man. And I mean,
there's a whole genre called alternate history that deals with this, where people create varying degrees of scenarios. So, you have the best known stuff like The Man in the High Castle, for example,
right?
Which is about the Japanese and the Germans.
That's a little bit further askew from the real history, but you're taking real history and just expounding on areas that are a little bit gray. I think it's brilliant what you did. I haven't read the book. Alternate history sounds interesting.
Yeah, alternate history. Well, thank you. But alternate history is a scale. You can be as sort of subtle with it as you want to be, or you can be as crazy with it as you want to be. And that's one of the joys of Sea Lion, who sort of Sea Lion is a publisher specifically dedicated to the alternate history genre. I think they may be the only publisher out there specifically dedicated to the alternate history genre. And the guys who run the company, and I have to admit, I almost didn't pitch to them because I discovered they did a novel called Agent Lavender, which Harold Wilson, who was the British Prime Minister at different points during the late 60s and throughout the 70s. There were Angleton and a guy named Roger Hollis in Britain's MI5 came to sincerely believe, for reasons that don't make a lot of sense when you delve into them, that Harold Wilson was in fact a Soviet agent, and that the guy leading Britain was in fact a Soviet spy. And they basically said, well, what if that conspiracy theory was true? And they wrote a whole novel based on that. I hadn't read that book when I wrote mine. I hadn't even heard of it until I was getting ready to pitch it. And I have to admit, I came fairly close to not pitching the book at all to them on the basis of that. But I did, and I was fortunate enough that they really liked the idea and wanted to run with it. But there's a whole scale on there of whatever your interest in history may be. Somebody has done a variation on it as an alternate history, I can guarantee you.
That's cool. How hated was McCarthy by the end of his reign of terror, I guess you could say? Was he the most despised politician in American politics at that time?
It's interesting because he was immensely popular with a certain section of people and remains such. He had a period of immense popularity. I don't think it was so much that McCarthy was loved so much as he was feared. And when the first chinks of his armor appeared in 53, 54, first with the CIA and then during the Army McCarthy hearings, everybody kind of came out at once kind of against him. There's a story, I think, in Thomas Wick's book at the beginning of Shooting Star, his biography of him, because he was a correspondent on the Hill in this period. So after McCarthy's downfall, he would meet McCarthy in the hallway. McCarthy would go down the hallway shaking people's hands and whatnot. And he was kind of became this kind of sad, pathetic figure, and somebody that I think that in a lot of ways people kind of looked at it and went, how did we tolerate this for as long as we did? And the answer to that in large extent is that at least in the early years, McCarthy's targets were predictably, were the opposition politics. They were the Truman administration. They were people who were on the other side who made easy targets. McCarthy's criticisms against him don't really start until he starts going after Republicans and Republican appointees. And it's at that point that the gloves come off, and indeed that Eisenhower as well starts making kind of public, kind of private statements, kind of on the record, kind of off the record to people, that starts leading to McCarthy's downfall. But he was essentially, I don't know that he was necessarily despised so much as people kind of pointed and laughed at him. I think that there's a quote, I think, from Eisenhower, in fact, not long before he died, that it wasn't so much that it was a McCarthyism so much as it was McCarthy used to be.
Yeah, that's actually kind of ironic. And you don't wish ill will on anybody, man, but that dude really was a person who, I mean, I'm trying to find a kind way to say it, but he got what he deserved in the end, I think, because he hurt a lot of people along the way.
He was immensely destructive to people's lives, their careers. There's reputations that were destroyed by McCarthy. Some people who eventually did get rehabilitated. But he created an atmosphere that allowed auxiliary things. We talked about the Chinese rocket scientists, for example. I mean, that never would have happened if McCarthy, and to an extent people like Richard Dixon over in HUAC, hadn't gotten involved in searching out this quote-unquote witch hunt. But also, he created an atmosphere where it made it difficult to recruit people into agencies that he was doing. There's basically throughout the 1950s, the best and brightest didn't go into government as they had during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. They avoided government because nobody wanted their reputations checked. Nobody wanted to be accused of being a closet communist as a result of this. I mean, there were people whose careers ended before they began because it was one of those, oh, you were a member of such and such society at your college, and that was a communist front organization, don't you know? But
And that ties into your take on it in the alternate history version, where by doing that, he was basically forwarding the communist agenda in the U.S., right?
Yeah, he created a lot of sympathy. But by the time it was over with, for a lot of these individuals, most of whom weren't guilty of anything, but it essentially discredited going after a lot of these organizations. Now, a lot of these laws stayed on the books for years. California, for example, passed a loyalty oath law that was still on the books as of just a few years ago. That if you were an employee of the state of California, you had to take a loyalty oath to the state of California and the United States. It's no kind of sort of exaggeration to say that there's a reason that in 1954, the words "under God and in God we trust" were added to the Pledge of Allegiance and to the U.S. currency that had not been there before. And that is also a side effect of the McCarthy period because, it's those godless atheistic communists. And it's a way of differentiating us from them. And it created, this kind of atmosphere where nobody took the threat of communist infiltration that seriously, to the point that throughout that later on, when we were trying to ferret people like John Walker, for example, the United States Navy, or Aldrich James out of the CIA in the 1990s, Robert Hansen famously in 2001, the reason that there was so much time and effort that had to be spent to uncover them, and why it took so much effort to convince people that, hey, there actually are Soviet agents inside the American government and inside our intelligence agencies, was that people could say, oh, this is just McCarthyism redressed for the whatever decade that we're in. So it became damaging in that respect as well. So there were long-term consequences and repercussions that came out of that.
The name
Most
of the
of them
book,
not good.
The name of the book is Our Man on the Hill. It's an alternate history fiction, and it's available on Amazon right now in Kindle version. Are you going to have a hardback version or a hardcover version, or possibly
I
paperback?
don't know. You would have to ask my publishers about that. So ask Sea Lion Press.
Well, let's
But
hope
for
the
the moment,
sales are so good that they have to put it out in paperback.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Good luck with the launch of this. The book has only been out for what, a week or two, couple weeks, months.
It's came out this past week.
Okay, cool. Congrats on the. This is your first novel, right?
Yes, it is.
All
Or
right,
the first
cool.
published one, anyway.
I saw a post on your Twitter feed. I am a novelist.
Yeah.
Good for you, man. I know you've been working
Thank
at it
you.
for a long time. You've had a couple of things in the works, and I'm not going to give any spoilers away. I do know that you got some other things that you're going to be rolling out, and hopefully pretty soon. But keep at it, man. Much success to you.
Thank you. We'll see how it goes. Writing is a lot like the old analogy of putting an infinite number of monkeys with typewriters in a room long enough, and eventually you get one of them will eventually type up the script for Hamlet. Writing is a lot like that. You put a lot of stuff out there, and eventually something clicks, hopefully.
Yeah. Now, in the creation of this novel, is there any science fiction elements in the novel itself?
Not really. I guess this is more of alternate history technically is a sci-fi subgenre, at least according to the Amazon algorithm, as I discovered. There's no, I was tempted at one point because, as I said, I was doing the research on the Dark Skies book in this period, and it would have been really fun to have done some kind of ufological tie-in to it. I resisted that temptation for better or worse in writing the book. Not to say that I'm against ever doing something. I mean, I have published some fiction that ties in with the UFO stuff, there is in fact an alternate history flash fiction piece I wrote in a book called 50 Flashes, called The Summer of 47, that ties into what if Truman had decided not to cover up Roswell in 500 words or less.
Oh wow, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, so that's available as well out there. I think it's on Lulu because of the way that publisher works. Wonderful publisher, I think Hortleberry Press, if I remember correctly. So there's nothing really overtly science fiction in the novel. There is a couple. There is, even though Doctor Who didn't start till '63, there's at least one Doctor Who reference hidden away in the book. For really knowing classic Who fans, you can spot there is a Doctor Who reference buried in the book somewhere.
How could you not put a Doctor Who reference in there? I mean, you're like the most authoritative Doctor Who person I know. I mean, I'm sure there's other people who know more about Doctor Who, but as far as in my circle of people, you are the most informed person on Doctor Who. So with that, you're also interested in UFOs. I wanted to get your take on some of the recent events within the UFO topic. What is the most interesting of the recent developments in your mind, as far as regards to UFOs?
I think the most interesting development that we've had so far, and there's actually two of them that kind of go hand in hand. One of which is that we do have the UAP task force, whose report is hopefully going to be due out sometime in the next month or so.
Hopefully,
yeah, hopefully, fingers crossed that works out. That's, I don't necessarily know that is going to be the slam dunk disclosure with a capital D that I think a lot of people in the UFO community are hoping for. But I think at this point, we're having an acknowledgement of something that hasn't been acknowledged before, which is that there are strange and unusual objects of unknown origin flying around in our skies. Now, whether they're alien spacecraft or drones from Russia, China, Timbuktu, I don't know. The fact that these things are flying around our ships, our military bases, our nuclear weapons with apparent impunity is deeply concerning. And the fact that, every time a Russian bomber flies into Alaskan airspace, the NORAD throws out a thing on Twitter about it. But whenever one of these sightings occurs, we hear jack squat. So the fact that it's even being acknowledged at all is a victory in itself. The 60-minute segment that aired, I think it was last Sunday, was a huge victory, I think, for those of us who have any kind of interest in this topic, and particularly wanting the topic to be seen with something less than little green men, laughter, bring down the curtain, etc.
X-Files theme song in the background,
the X-Files theme song, and everything, and everything else. And the fact that it was presented rationally, and it was presented in the Joe Friday Dragnet, just the facts. We're not going to speculate here. Here's this stuff where you can see it. The interesting thing has been watching the more skeptical side of the community, and also, the people who generally promote the kind of the skeptical view of, oh, there's nothing to this topic, now having to go into wheel spinning and sharp left turns trying to explain what in the world these things are. I get deeply amused every time I see there was a meteorologist here in North Alabama where I live. And he has been posting debunking stuff left, right, and center. And watching his comment thread has been really interesting because there's a lot of people who are, suddenly informed on this topic going, yeah, you can say that the video might be, my favorite one is there's a video that supposedly is now a weather balloon traveling at subsonic speed despite being tracked at super hypersonic speeds on this camera. And they're saying, well, the video, and if you do trigonometry and it turns out this way, and it's like, yeah, but you're ignoring pilots saw this thing visually. There was a radar contact on this thing. There was more. This video is not the be all and end all of the story. And I think watching them have to deal with that has been an interesting kind of experience, because I think it's become one of those things where I think it was perfectly acceptable to go weather balloon, swamp gas, lights in the sky, flares, Venus for the longest time. And we've reached a point where those excuses do not work anymore.
I agree.
For better or worse.
Yeah, and a lot of people are scrambling and backpedaling and trying to protect their reputation because they've been, proponents of everything in the skies can be explained, and that's simply not the
Yeah,
case. If the military, with all of their technology, all of their training, and all of the data that they have on these things, can't explain what it is, how is somebody from even if they have a scientific background, they just simply don't have all the data. They can't explain what it is, and they can only
yeah.
speculate. But people are taking a
I mean,
hard line stance on what these things are not, and saying
yeah,
definitively that and they're defending their position, and
yeah,
it's starting to backfire on some people. And I
yeah.
agree. It's interesting to see that. I, Okay, so let's move on to that. Skeptics are a bane of the UFO community. I think that they are a necessary element because they do
Oh yeah,
bring something to the conversation, um,
yeah.
but
They
sometimes
keep
they
us
go beyond.
honest. Yeah, I mean the skeptics, for better or worse, they do keep us honest, and
Yeah,
they force us because I think that there is, and in some ways, ufology is its own worst enemy, and that we have been in the past too willing to take things on face value without evidence. Do I say Roswell slides here, for example? I
alien
mean that thing did
autopsy.
alien autopsy. I mean these things did huge damage to ufology, trying to say, hey, there are things in the sky which are unusual. Yeah, but you guys also fell for this, and this. Which certainly does not help, when you're trying to make a case that there is something very strange going on that needs to be looked at.
Sure.
But the skeptics keep us honest. As much as I get annoyed with Brian Dunning at Skeptoid from time to time, I very much enjoy his podcast, and I cannot tell you the number of times I've linked to his episode on Valiant Thor, for example, and basically had to go, this is all made up. This guy's done the research, and we can prove it. Please stop posting this. You're not helping.
Yeah,
The skeptics are a necessary evil, and they force us to take harder looks at things. They can go off in some very strange tangents. Mick West with his hypersonic seagull, for example. I think my favorite skeptical thing of the last couple of years, watching one of those videos being explained by a seagull traveling at supersonic speeds.
yeah.
Um,
He
but
gets ridiculed
the,
quite a bit for that. I think he may have
yeah,
changed his stance on that
I think he
particular
has.
theory because he gets a lot of flack for that one. Um,
Yeah,
I really don't follow Mick
deservedly
West
so, I
too.
have to say.
Oh, what's that?
I think deservedly so ridiculed for that one, because that one
Definitely,
is
yeah.
just,
That
yeah.
that's beyond reasonable. Um, so you mentioned the UAPTF report that's coming out in June. What are your hopes and what are your expectations? So you've got the ideal scenario. What would you hope that it revealed? And but what are your expectations?
I think, like a lot of people who've been around this topic, and even myself, kind of taking in an outside-in perspective when I was working on the Dark Skies book, I think a lot of us who've spent time with this and have come to the conclusion that there's something more to this than weather balloons and swamp gas, would very much like, if nothing else, affirmation and confirmation. I think that's just a typical human thing to want, is to sort of to know that this thing that we've been interested in does indeed exist. Um,
Of what though?
I think that I think we've reached a point where we're having confirmation that there is something up there, having been told for so long that there is nothing up there. And I think my expectation for the report, rather than what I would very much like it to be, my expectation is that we will have more confirmation of that. There will probably be new sightings that we're probably not aware of, or that we've heard of, tangentially,
Okay,
sort of
don't dodge
confirmed.
my question, man. I asked you.
I'm trying not
I,
to.
I asked you what do you want? I mean, what in a I mean,
What I really want is for the president of the United States to go on primetime TV and wheel out wreckage from Roswell well,
That's it,
Aztec
man.
and God knows where else,
That's what
and
I'm
kind of
talking
do
about.
as they talk about AD after disclosure, do the whole speech. And Bryce, in fact, I think Bryce himself wrote it on the Trail of the Saucers, which is his whole Medium thing, has done a version of the speech that Joe Biden ought to give when the report drops, saying
Cool.
that, we've been aware of this since the 1940s, and it's not all true, but a good chunk of it is. My own stance in terms of what I believe is that something probably came down at Roswell, Aztec, and God knows what else. I think the problem is that it occurred to me when I was researching the Dark Skies book that there's been a lot of effort put into the perception that the U.S. government knows, if it doesn't know everything, it knows a lot. And my own honest feeling, based on the stuff I read and that I heard, particularly from Brent Friedman, about an encounter he had with a gentleman that he was acquainted with when he was younger who worked in the Reagan administration, is that the U.S. government knows there's something there, but they don't know what it is. And that they don't have all the answers. And that in government, the only thing more terrifying than having some answers is having no answers. But I think we've reached the point now where they're having to admit some things. I don't think that there's going to be any wheeling out of wreckage from, Roswell or wherever when this report drops, as much as I would love to see that. My expectation is that we'll find out more than we know, and we'll have a lot of things confirmed. Notably, that there is something buzzing around in our skies with some fairly serious national security implications. Because, as I said earlier, whoever these things belong to, whether they belong to, little gray men from Zeta Reticuli, or in Moscow or Beijing or Timbuktu, the fact that they can do the things that they're doing is deeply concerning, and ought to be studied, and it ought to be paid attention to, and it ought to be officially acknowledged. Because if 70 years of UFO research has taught us anything, the government very much has a tendency to say, "Oh yeah, this isn't real, and we have no interest in it," while pursuing an interest in it.
Mhm.
Getting them to even admit that they have an interest in it, I think, is a victory. We're fighting, ufology is a war, and it is a long-running series of battles and skirmishes. And sometimes we win, and sometimes we don't. But I have a feeling, my hope, I should say, rather than my feeling, is that this could be a very big victory for us, or it could blow up in our face, and it could be, they could wheel out the Condon report from 1969 again and go, "Yeah, we looked into this, nothing to it. Carry on, move along." I don't think they're going to get away with it this time.
I hope not, man. There have been some speculation that it could be Condon 2.0. I just, that would be a really severe gut punch to the UFO community. It would more than likely disenchant the greater public. And
Yeah,
I don't think that the majority of the UFO community would be too negatively affected by it, because they're going to continue to do what they've always done:
yeah,
research, try to find answers, continue to pursue the truth. But the greater public right now is at a precarious point in this whole topic. Like, some
yeah,
people are like waiting to hear more. Some people are still like not even interested to hear what's going to come out. But
yeah.
if it is nixed by a Condon 2.0 kind of report, then all of those people that were on the fence and all of those people that were still looking the other way are going to be lost.
Yeah. Hopefully, it
So
won't come to that. So
I hope not, man. That it would
I
just be it would hurt the cause tremendously.
it does seem to me, having, kind of looked at it, that this topic seems to work on like a 20, 30-year cycle with the public at large, where, you think about, there was the 50s, and then we again in the 70s, and then again in the 90s, and now in the late 2010s and early 2020s, we're back here. And it seems like we pick up a little bit of momentum every time. So maybe this is the one that gets the ball, just a little more up the hill, if we're lucky. But it's, we're sitting here watching it with great interest, and it'll be fascinating to see what's going to happen one way or the other.
So I'm going to ask you to speculate one more time, and
Okay.
because there really is no answer that I have heard that satisfies all of what's happening. But why do you think right now, of all these times in histories, like you said, every 20, 30 years we come up to this precipice, and so far we've backed away. But this time it seems like we're about ready to get over that hump. What do you think is driving this?
I think it's us. I think it's the public doing it. I think also this time we managed, for better or worse, we got the press on side. Leslie Kean at the New York Times, for example, that New York Times piece in 2017 literally opened doors. I don't think that piece, the importance of that piece can be exaggerated, nor can the importance of the 60 Minutes piece that just aired last Sunday can be exaggerated, because it put this information, some of which was known to the UFO community, some of which was not, and it put it to the public in a major way. And it did it in a source that was more reputable than the Weekly World News. Which, no offense to the larger UFO community, many of whom I follow on Twitter and whom I've had wonderful interactions with, but in terms of the mainstream media and in terms of a lot of members of John Q. Public or people like my mom, for example, those are not legitimate sources as far as they're concerned. When it's in the New York Times, when it's on 60 Minutes, or your local, your TV news is portraying this as, this is a real thing that has happened and that needs to be taken seriously, and it's not surrounded by new agey woo woo, or we're going to stage a fake alien invasion, but you can call in UFOs by meditating if you give me $299 to learn how. I think it does a lot to help the subject. I think it's the fact that we got the press on side through people like Leslie Kean, but also that somebody was willing to report on this topic seriously and basically ignored some of the other, I think, I don't want to say less legitimate aspects of this field, but certainly ufology has a tendency to try and present everything up front. And you throw people with a lot of information at once and it becomes overwhelming. Or you end up saying something that comes across as, you've got to be kidding me. I can give an example of that with my mom. When I was researching the Dark Skies book, she had knee surgery, so I was staying with her quite a bit. And at one point, we watched the documentary Unacknowledged on Netflix together. And for the first half of it, she was very interested in the subject. She worked for defense contractors and whatnot. So the stuff about UFOs affecting nukes and stuff being seen was very interesting to her. And there's a moment in that when somebody holds up a document and goes, and Marilyn Monroe died because of UFOs. And she checked out. And it never got her back. And I think the UFO community and ufology in general can be its worst enemy. Because we're willing to present sometimes dubious, sometimes outlandish on the surface information that makes everybody else around us kind of go, look at you like you're the crazy uncle at the Christmas party.
So, and with that in mind, you've already told me a little bit about what your mom has said, but what are some of the other things that you're hearing from people who previously were really showed no interest or completely disbelieved the topic of UFOs?
I think when the Dark Skies book came out and it was very clear that it was about UFOs, I had some friends reach out to me, people I'd gone to high school with, people I used to work with at one of my old jobs, who suddenly reached out to me. And in some cases, I got UFO sightings told to me. One of my British friends messaged me to ask me what my opinion was on Roswell, which was a very odd thing to receive from somebody who had no interest, as far as I knew before that, in the UFO topic. Reached out to me, and my stance on Roswell, for anybody who's interested, is that having gone through all the scenarios from crashed alien spacecraft to Nazi flying wing bomber flown by Soviet deformed children, to us crashing, Americans flying and crashing these things in the desert, I have to say, crashed alien spaceship is not the most outlandish and craziest scenario that I came across in terms of Roswell. I think there's people who I think may have had a closet interest in it who are now willing to express their interest in it vocally. I think there's people who have kind of dismissed it as, oh, this is kind of, this is X-Files territory. This makes great storytelling, but I don't really believe it. Who are suddenly going, oh, there may be something to this after all. But there's still skepticism from some quarters, as perhaps there ought to be. Again, I don't think we should accept everything on face value, and a little skepticism isn't a bad thing. When you reach the point that you just dismiss everything outright, though, I think is where you have issues. But the kind of the wording on the ground is suddenly that, particularly with the military and the Department of Defense going, hey, there are things that we can't identify flying around, and they're doing this, this, and this. I've suddenly noticed a lot of people sitting up, particularly where I live is around the Redstone Arsenal and the Marshall Space Flight Center. There's a lot of people suddenly sitting up and going, oh, these might be real after all.
Yeah, well, it's for a lot of people, I think it's a rude awakening, and I don't know what the implications of that are. That could lead us down a rabbit hole that could take us another half hour to iron out. So we won't really go into that at this point. What I would like to do is, what are your final thoughts on UFO topic, the book, and then throw in there, if you could, if you're interested, throw in there, what is your next project? I know you're promoting the book right now, but what is it you're working on, and what can people expect to see from you in the future?
So we'll kind of take that in order. So we'll start with the UFO topic. My kind of closing thoughts for today on the UFO topic is that we're living in a very interesting moment. And as the old Chinese saying and curse says, may you live in interesting times. And good grief, if that's ever been true about this topic, it's right now. So the next few months are going to be really interesting. In terms of the book, I hope that people enjoy it as a novel, as a spy thriller, and hopefully take away a slightly smuggled in history lesson about this period and about the realities versus the perceptions and the fear mongering of the Red Scare and the McCarthy era. And also, I hope to kind of people look at McCarthy in a different way. McCarthy in some ways was, he was a rags to riches figure, the kind of person that in American society and culture we admire, the people who pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And, if McCarthy had gone slightly differently, I think he might have been a very admirable figure. But instead, I think at least the McCarthy of our real world, I think was ambitious to a fault, and it destroyed him. But I hope people enjoy an interesting alternate history spy thriller with quite a bit of real history thrown in, and that it intrigues them enough to go read up more on the nonfiction side of the topic. In terms of upcoming projects, I'm in the middle of research phases still on a book I talked about the last time I was on here, which has the working title of Cold War Cold Cases, which will be looking at a lot of, as it were, the unsolved mysteries of the Cold War period, things that we don't have definitive answers to. The things like the disappearance of Raoul Wallenberg, who was a Swedish diplomat who saved thousands of Jews during World War II, but was arrested by the Soviets at the end of the war, and his exact fate remains unknown to this day. And the sinking of the USS Scorpion in 1968, one of our nuclear submarines disappeared under very strange circumstances, which the Navy has never completely and adequately explained. And I've also been commissioned, going back to Obverse in my Dark Skies book. The Silver Archive is, in fact, a spin-off of a series of books called The Black Archive, focusing on Doctor Who. And I think I'm allowed to say that I will be writing a book on a very recent episode of Doctor Who that aired last year. And I'm in the research phase for that, and that will be out sometime in 2024, hopefully. If you want to know more about my many and varying interests and have any questions for me, I'm on Facebook and Twitter. My Twitter handle is @KresalWrites, KRESALWRITS, and I have a Facebook page, which is facebook.com/KresalWrites.
Do you have a website?
I ought to get a website one of these days. I have a LiveJournal blog I don't update often enough, that's for sure. I actually need to go out and talk about, because I don't think I've ever posted about the Dark Skies book, let alone the novel. And I occasionally do some ramblings out there. So that's, I think it's timdalton007.livejournal.com. And if you're interested in my kind of geeky output reviewing science fiction, especially Doctor Who audio dramas, there's a website I contribute to called Warp Factor, which you can find as well. So basically type my name into Google and nerdy goodness will sort of flow out.
Cool. Hang out just for a second after I close out the live stream so we can chat a minute, and then and then I'll let you go. But for everybody that checked in and joined the conversation today, thank you so much for being here. For anybody that's watching this on the replay, thank you very much. Please continue to like and subscribe to the videos. Support the channel by sharing it with and letting people know about the channel. This is a new time slot. It's added to the other 2 times that the show airs, and I appreciate everybody who comes and watches the show. And Matthew, I appreciate you so much, my friend. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
I'm always grateful for getting to come on here and have a chance to talk about my many and varying interests. So as I said earlier, I am nerd, hear me bore.
Very cool. And with that, thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.